Thank you so much, and I also too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered here today. And I'd really like to thank Matt as well for the invitation to speak with you all. And I think Bill and Wendy did an outstanding job actually at sort of presenting the serious sort of difficulties that have been happening over the last couple of years in relation to cooperation around pandemic response. And so there's a risk that I'm going to repeat myself, and worse than that, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a political scientist, so I could get a whole series of things wrong, so you just have to forgive me, sorry. Matt said that when I have gotten things right, I actually think I probably have gotten a lot of things wrong, to be honest, watching COVID-19. So for me, this conversation today about the two-track approach, which we're starting to see emerge around whether or not we try and strengthen the international health regulations, and it's two things. Do we try and do this, or do we also try and do, divide, sort of invest in a pandemic treaty, has been something that I've been really interested in watching. And I suppose today I'm going to give you a conversation of how I'm thinking about it. So we've all heard already the timelines that were really crucial. And I think it is important actually to point out that while we look at this now as the 31st of December 2019, we received the first report, the WHO Director General doesn't declare a fake or fake until 30th of January. For someone like myself, I look at that who've been looking at this area now for a good 15 years, and I think that's pretty good. You could make the argument that that was when the IHR was revised in 2005, the objective was to usher in an era of rules-based disease surveillance and response. And to some extent, what we saw over that period of 30 days for all its imperfections was an attempt to try and devise or implement some sort of rules around how they were going to try and adjust to a situation that was still highly unknown. Information was not perfect. We've seen now this great piece in the Lancet that's been published this month by CDC and others, sort of detailing just in depth what was not known in that 30 days. The issues that then start to come in, and I think this is true, was about whether or not we declare a pandemic, and we see not till the 11th of March the World Health Organization able to do this, and they do this on the basis of these non-binding guidelines that were drawn up in 2017. As the virus spread around the world now, we have 7 vaccines that have obtained WHO emergency use listing, but there are over 4 billion people only who've received 1 dose, and there's over 40% of the world's population who have not received any dose of vaccine. And the majority live in sub-Saharan Africa, but also there is a strong representation of populations without vaccination in Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Pacific, Eastern Europe. And we also know there are some serious intersectional inequalities that are driving who gets access to vaccine as well. There's serious gender inequalities, there's serious inequalities around race, ethnicity, religion, as well as disability. So the outbreak of COVID-19 has caused immense political, economic and health impacts, and in many instances, the instinctive response of states has been to do the opposite of WHO's recommendations as time has gone on. They imposed travel measures that locked down borders, they attempted to slow or redirect trade in vital equipment, including personal protection equipment, and they enacted quarantine measures that have now been found by the United Nations Human Rights Council special group that was set up to sort of assess the human rights implications of COVID-19 to have breached international human rights across a large number of areas. And the economic consequence of locking down entire countries has led to unparalleled quantitative easing and state spending measures that states are going to have to recover from for years to come. UNICEF has announced just yesterday that the pandemic has posed the most serious threat to progress and child progress in the history of the organisation. And as has been said already, the strength of health systems have been found exposed and wanting, including in high-income countries, with records of research excellence in infectious diseases. So how did the world come together? What we found is that cooperation was not the first instinct of many states, including the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council, engagement in multilateral institutions from the group of 7 to the group of 20, to the UN Assembly even, struggled to find how to produce consensus on the type of COVID-19 collective governance that should be prioritised. Investment in vaccination discovery and then its production has produced clear winners, and this has not been done with consideration of equity, collaboration, or capacity building. In May 2020, the World Health Assembly did agree, however, to an investigation into the origins of the outbreak, and at the same time it was also agreed that there would be a review of the international health regulations for its functioning in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and as we've heard already, there was also being, through the Director General, the creation of the IPPPR. The Director General was instructed to form the review panel with findings to be released at the 2021 World Health Assembly in May. And the first meeting of the panel to review the revised international health regulations then provided their report in April 2021, which was then heard for discussions at the World Health Assembly in May 2021. During this time, as has been said already, we had sort of preemption, if you like, of that review of the international health regulations, with discussions being put forward about the need for a pandemic treaty, that there were gaps and flaws in the international health regulations that couldn't be covered, no matter how much we might try to address them, and there needed to be this additional instrument to try and cover those serious gaps. This then in May 2021 at the World Health Assembly led to the creation of the working group that was set up to look into strengthening emergency response, which was co-led by the United States and Indonesia. Their decision then was to hold a series of working group meetings and to provide reports, assessments of what was occurring from those discussions, which then led to the final release of a report in November. It's going to coincide with the World Health Assembly's special session to discuss the merits of a pandemic treaty and also the international health regulations and their strengthening. And it's interesting because in a recent webinar, the two co-chairs of this, Colin McKeith from the United States and Ambassador Greta Ghebreyesus, both talked about these dual mandates that they were trying to manage, strengthening the IHR and the pandemic treaty as being constantly challenging. They were always in conflict. And it's interesting even now, they both made a point of saying that while we've had the November-December session that has decided to agree to proceed with this discussions around a pandemic treaty or some sort of instrument, there is still yet the conversation to continue now about the international health regulations and what shape they should take, how they should be strengthened, to what extent they should be strengthened. And that's going to be happening in the first half actually the first quarter of next year. And so for me, the question has been the whole way through this is, why are we pursuing both? Can we have both? Given we are in a situation where politically there is not a lot of will to come together and collaborate and cooperate over the last 2 years. I think there is actually a need to not hope for politics to sort of come together in this space, but actually to think about with great seriousness, the politics that we have today may be what is going to stay. We have serious divisions, and these divisions are not just in the World Health Assembly, they are in other areas of the United Nations institutions as well at the moment, that are really hampering cooperation across a range of other areas that are also, time dependent and require a lot of serious investment and attention that is just not coming to the fore. So for me, I would like to sort of pose the question, do we think this treaty can deliver what the international health regulations which we have, which are ones that are perhaps not at they're sort of, if you like, secondary law, but they are there. At the moment, you require states to sort of withdraw from them. At the moment, they have that unique feature of the WHO Constitution that allows that all states are expected to some extent to be to implement them. And do we think that it's worth sort of introducing a lot of diplomacy and a lot of investment of time, which is now going to happen over the next couple of years with these regional consultations, into a pandemic treaty or whatever instrument it is that they decide on, that requires states to sign on to implement, to check, there's a lot more process that's required around this. So I'm going to make 5 cases for why we should progress with the treaty, and 5 cases why I think we maybe shouldn't. So I'm undecided. So the case 4. So the first case is that the World Health Organization has not been ambitious enough historically. And in some respects, it's suffering from the consequence of seeing itself as a technical organisation and not as a political organisation. The Constitution permits it to introduce new norms. It's there. The framework tobacco and the IHR are really only the sort of, and the breast milk substitutes, are really the only kind of areas, and I think you could also argue the attempt to try and create virus sharing mechanisms, which I know far more learned people are going to talk about than myself. These are kind of the areas where they've really tried to sort of progress new normative standards. And so the argument is, if they're suffering in terms of their sort of status in the world, this is the time to do it. The guidelines around pandemics are weak. There was this hesitancy. We're going to see more, not less, of these sorts of pandemic perhaps and spillover events. So enter into this space now. The IHR, as I just said, is secondary law. It's not a treaty law. It cannot enjoy the direct effect, and we've seen this problem with the IHR in terms of the way states prioritise it, implement it. It sits in the health departments, which in some countries is an important, well-funded space, and other countries it simply is not. They're not the most powerful voice in the room. They may not always be able to push forward the IHR ahead of all the other type of health priorities that sit in that country. And so this is an attempt to try, if you like, circumvent that sort of rigid sort of position of health and the way it sits in some countries, governance and architecture, and introduce a treaty law which would require a prioritisation of different arms of government across the world to sort of think about how to implement this. The IHR does not address equity in any of the way in which it approaches the health countermeasures. It is very much around trying to develop that kind of coordinated rule-based response to disease outbreaks, but it's not about trying to address inequity, which is why we see things like the core capacity evaluation criteria for the IHR doesn't really address in substantive ways, universal healthcare coverage, the participation of local communities and healthcare workers in the way in which they evaluate it, which we now know those groups were actually vital for the response to COVID-19 over the last 2 years, and they received the highest volume of trust in a recent survey that's been done with over 40 countries. These groups aren't in the IHR, so there's a problem here in the sense that we're not giving them any power, any recognition. The IHR does have some human rights provisions, but they are minimal. And there's been a lot of critique of the fact that there is a tension here in the IHR about how it balances the trade and travel restrictions, the quarantine arrangements with the rights of individuals, and particularly the rights of diverse individuals, juxtaposed to the right of the state. And then finally, states are not always adhering to the IHR recommendations. And so there is a serious question to be asked about whether or not there is a need to kind of kickstart the infectious disease surveillance process. And is the treaty the way in which we can do that? Is the political gridlock, because we've tried for 15 years to make an instrument work across an all-hazards approach, and it's just not breaking through politically? It's kind of lost that sense of urgency, it's lost that sense of prioritisation, and so there could also be an issue here in the sense that the IHR didn't break through in January, March, April, May in 2020 because it just hadn't registered in a vast number of countries' processes of how at the emergency response level they're thinking about what are their priorities in terms of responding to this outbreak and how much they need to listen to the recommendations being issued by the WHO through the FEAR committee. And Mark Epperson-Turner and Gianluca Berci detailed this in a lot of depth in an article that they wrote, where they sort of went through the degree to which the recommendations issued by these CEIC committees, not just for COVID, but for previous outbreaks in the last 10 years, have kind of not had this consistent approach where states have taken on all the recommendations. So we kind of had some warnings before COVID-19 that this was a problem. So those are the reasons for. The reasons against. So I think the first one is that, as I said before, the international health regulations, for all their faults, doesn't require a national ratification procedure at the same degree as the treaty. It is very politically risky to introduce a response framework that could have patchwork adoption and application. It may not reach that kind of volume of, if you like, sort of thinking through it through a normative life cycle. If you're not getting that diffusion, that tipping point where you have a vast number of states signing on to it, implementing it, feeling compelled to adhere to it, over time, it may also lose its potency. And then you've not just then removed or said that the IHR can't get us where we need to go, you've then also said that the treaty can't get us where we need to go. So we're adding on more layers that aren't necessarily going to work. And that's a risk for the World Health Organization, to be the architect, to be holding, to be standing over instruments that are just not having effect on state behaviour. I think there's a degree to which, and I think the review that was done, the expert review of the international health regulations that was submitted in May 2021, really does detail actually that this is a very encompassing legal instrument. To some extent, the problem has not been what the instrument doesn't cover. It's the bravery, perhaps sometimes, of the Director General. It's the understanding of the emergency committee. It's their consistency of their application of what they can do and can't do under the IHR. It's also about the way in which states are being brought in to understand and engage with all the different articles of the IHR. We're dealing with 66 articles here and 2 appendices and 9 annexes. It's a big instrument. It has been really pushed forward largely, as I said before, on the health departments. And, you know, there's not necessarily been a lot of creativity, it could be argued here, in terms of thinking over the last 10 years about how this instrument can be understood and communicated at that real state-to-state regional level. There has been a patchwork effort, as noted, even in 2019. So before COVID-19, there was a review done of the implementation of the IHR, and it was noted that it was becoming too patchworky, a lot of dependence on bilateral relationships to sort of propel this sort of implementation. So it may not be the instrument that's the problem, but it's kind of the way in which we thought about how to make sure that states are understanding and adhering to it. The IHR is this all-hazards approach, and while that's seen as a drawback in the case of pandemics, it's actually really powerful if we think about the fact that we are going to see more and more emergency events, health that are going to affect health, that will extend beyond COVID-19. One of the important reasons, I think, why the IHR in 2005 was so important was because we'd gone through SARS, and yet there was a determination that the IHR would not just apply to health events, but apply to these biological, radiological, chemical events. It could have applied, for example, to the Fukushima disaster and the earthquake. You know, it had this potential to be much more expensive. There was discussions about whether or not it should actually be on a continued basis. You should have actually a sitting emergency committee that would always be thinking and responding to disasters throughout the year. So there was a lot more, again, I would argue, creativity that was canvassed that hasn't necessarily been pursued. This was raised in the 2011 review after 2009 H1N1. It was raised again after the Ebola outbreak in 2014, 2015 and the 2016 review. So we're not in new terrain here about discussing about how the IHR actually gives powers to do things a little bit differently in terms of the governance. It's just, again, being able to get this cooperation through the World Health Secretariat, but also with the Executive Board and through states to really think about how you can make what we have more effective. This second last one is controversial. The problem could possibly be that the problem with the international health regulations and potentially the problem with the pandemic treaty is that you're relying upon a WHO Director General to activate or to really sort of take on the IHR. And I think it's notable that the IPPPR did recommend a one-term for the WHO Director General. And that's been recommended actually for a lot of UN positions. That when you're thinking about re-election, it's really hard sometimes to be brave, to quote, yes, Prime Minister, and I'm showing my age here, but to be politically brave, you know? It's not just because you're thinking about your career, it's also because you're thinking of the people around you and the work and the importance of the organisation being seen as a legitimate actor in the space. But the argument could be, particularly in that January period, and I think the Lancet piece was a very good way of kind of hedging around it, but there was clearly instances there where information was not coming out. And so the degree to which that could have been publicly declared and pushed forward, we'll never know. But I think, well, we might if someone writes biography, but I think there is an issue here where the WHO Director General can sometimes be in a really difficult position. So the problem may not always be the instruments we have, but actually the leadership. And again, I would note that the IPPR recommendation there has kind of gone a bit quiet, but I think it's a really important one to think about. Not just for WHO, but for other UN agencies as well, institutions. And then my final one is that maybe we need to look at this a bit differently, and I hinted at this in the beginning, and this is that maybe the IHR performed better than what we're giving it credit for. And that's a controversial one, but it's one that it's one that I think is worth us considering in the situation where we had, to some extent, the surveillance, detection, communication, release of information, the things that we were worried that we would not be able to do just, 15 years ago, we were able to do that. There was problems around the cooperation and the coordination. There's definitely problems around equity. There are extreme problems here as well around the types of politics that were associated with the release of information, the origins investigation, punitive measures. These were all there, that is true. But I also think you could make the argument that there were certain behaviours that were, I would think you could say, are substantively different. I think the concern right now is what we've seen with Omicron, which is now there's the normalisation of the trade and travel measures now and the inequity there. That for me is actually the real concern, because that, and I think it was right to say, I think it's Helen Clark who said recently that could be gone now from the IHR for good. And if that is the case, then we are perhaps at a point where the IHR could be in a bit of trouble going forward. So in my conclusion, I suppose in an environment where there's minimal political will, where there are serious disagreements about what should be the content of this new instrument, should it be about equity? Should it be about information and surveillance detection? Should it be about technology? Should it be about power sharing? Do we want to pursue this and invest all of our time and effort into this in a very fragile diplomatic arena that we're in at the moment? Or do we think that because of the fragility that we're in, because of the fact that there is a lot of concern that what's being done is not breaking through, that we need to invest all of our effort into the next 2 years, despite it not being enough right now, that we need to have an eye to the next couple of decades and be thinking about what we would like states to be pursuing, and this, if we take that non-life cycle approach, where do we want states to all be tipping over into changing their behaviour by the end of 2030? That's me. Thank you.